Octofinals of this argument, and we get the sponsor. The opening government, Princeton A. For opening oppositions, UCD, LHA. Closing government, Melbourne A. Closing opposition, Yale B. I'm Vicky, judging with me will be Archie, Ari, Ayal, and James. And without further ado, I'd like to call upon the first speaker to vote.
Funny that opening opposition starts their speech by saying, yeah, you guys get some growth on your side, without realizing that's a pretty damning concession. Because we told you, insofar as you're able to make tangible economic benefits and tangible political benefits for individual citizens right now, that is the sort of impact that you have the most certainty in, and actually means an individual's life is better. Because look, think bigger picture. If you think there should be some sort of political reform, or you think there should be increased ability for internally for people to be able to create better economic conditions for themselves, the reason this comes about, the place you get things like more democracy, is when you see more rapid growth. When you see the ability of individual people to have access to wealth and have access to political power and to the sorts of structures where they're able to fight back to make their lives better. That is why it is the highest order condition in the round, and then sort of laughing out of his argumentation doesn't make sense. Three things said in this speech. First, I'm going to rebuild the stuff that I told you, then direct responses to OO, and then finally do some reframing of this round and why we've been just from PM. Let's start with the responses they gave you for this material. Firstly, they told you the growth is inevitable, so this stuff doesn't work. Firstly, no, it's a comparative. If we still show that you get more growth, you're voting for us. But also, their literal reasoning here is that China has a lot of people, so it's inevitably going to grow. So does India, it has 1 billion people. But the fact that it's not politically expansionist, is why it can't control international orders to make sure people are cooperating with you and making deals in your own favor, and why you're not getting a massive amount of foreign direct investment that's based on things like signaling and how you approach yourself and position yourself in the global economy. They also say that you get better political influence if South Asia binds together, and that helps China. Firstly, I think it's much better for China to be the superpower within that specific region, which is why the argumentation that they gave you about why it's able to exert itself as the power in the East means that you're more likely to get deals that are favorable to China specifically. But secondarily, the argument here is that insofar as you're able to politically convince those countries to cooperate with you, you get better coalitions because the coalitions that you have in Southeast Asia are one that act in the interest of China. That means if you care about coalitions in the region, we're vastly outweighing on this point because it's the sort of thing that resolves regional skirmishes and actually leads to stability in the region. Now let's talk about the arguments they gave you. Firstly, they say you get retaliation and trade wars. Okay. First of all, note that insofar as these sorts of things just are vastly outweighed by the amount of economic growth you get and the sorts of investment you get, it just doesn't matter. For example, the fact that the Belt and Road Initiative exists means that a lot of foreign investors are switching from investing in U.S. projects and focusing on these markets that are super underdeveloped, places like in Africa, places like in the Middle East, where we're able to literally build things like bridges that allow you to make manufacturers in China be more efficient, which this is not like abstract economic stuff, right? It means people get more jobs, laborers are being able to be paid more, you have access to like the rare earth metals you need to build your technology, and so forth. You literally cannot grow with access to this sort of stuff. But also, on the idea that the U.S. it's like that you're going to retaliate with an aid package to help people. Firstly, the U.S. doesn't do that. Like the fact that the U.S. is not joining into things like the Belt and Road Initiative means that China is actually establishing itself as the new authority in this sphere. But secondarily, so what if the U.S. also helps develop other areas? That's great for China because it means that now the markets that it's trying to develop to build roads and ports and bridges in so that it can literally economically have access to those areas, be able to enter those markets are even more developed. That sounds super good to me for an individual that wants to make the world better. The second argument they give you is that people are super suspicious of Chinese entry and they think it's going to be super expansionist. Seems like they didn't hear all of the framing that they gave you as to why China will fundamentally be positioned as an opposition power to the West. So it's not a question of whether people are suspicious. It's a question of whether you're able to see some incentive in better expanding those markets. Also, just think about the actual relative impacts here. The importance of the telephone industry pales in comparison to the amount of growth you get from things like manufacturing, being able to access exports better, which means that if you're making an economic decision about which world you want to live in, you're going to support that overall. Finally, they say China is super reliant on foreign capital investment. I think that's a serious mischaracterization of what's happening right now. Firstly, we told you China is actually buying a lot of debt from foreign nations, which means that they're less likely to do things U.S. is denominated in Chinese currency, but also we think that means that also when you do things like develop other parts of the world, those parts of the world are pretty grateful for that sort of thing. Like, that's a reason why political leaders are more likely to cooperate with China, and individuals across the world feel like at least China is doing something for them, whereas previously it's only the West that's seen as a beneficial authority. Because remember, this is something that seems to be missing around. There's a difference between physical expansionism and political expansionism. Like, the point of political expansionism is you're doing things like strategic cooperation or strategic economic investment that means you're better positioned to have your ideologies and your specific incentives leveraged in a way that's likely to help you. Take those in.
Generally, when China builds these infrastructure projects, they also force that the projects be built by Chinese laborers. That would seem to take off the host country, given how it undermines the local economy.
So one, sounds like Chinese laborers are getting jobs, so it seems like it directly helps the Chinese people. This is not a debate about whether the developing world is better off. It's a question about whether it's in the interest of the Chinese people. Secondarily, maybe some people are ticked off, but in the vast majority of cases, the fact that there's at least some attention given to these nations, when they've previously not been given attention without the sort of projects that China is conducting on a global scale, is good. And secondarily, I think in the vast majority of cases, they tend to cause net benefits because China and Xi Jinping are very, very aware that the way that they do these projects is super important. Like, they do not want to screw them up. They know people are seeing and using this as a litmus test as to whether China is going to be effective. And given the positioning and the stuff that Diaz told you about why they have an incentive to act in the best interest that they can, this is really good. Final argument they give you is that there's internal issues that are super bad. Firstly, note that people dissent against the Politburo all the time. Like, Xi Jinping is curtailing dissent for the reason that systematically people have spoken out against this. There's really no meaningful trade-off there. But secondarily, I think rapid growth is the reason that they're able to get more democracy, individuals are able to have wealth, and so forth, which takes out opening opposition. It might have sounded nice, but it doesn't actually lead to the most important impacts in the round. Now I'm going to do a serious amount of framing. Why does the stuff that we tell you mean that it's inevitably in the interest of the Chinese people? Firstly, note, things like the international order treating China more seriously because you have political ties to them and you have political engagement with international communities isn't just about getting another veto. It's things like the WTO striking down U.S. steel tariffs that harm the Chinese community because suddenly an actor that's not one of these traditional Western powers is able to have a say in these sorts of international agreements. Like, they're not just things that people like to talk about, right? They have tangible impacts on the sorts of industries that are able to develop, which means that for an individual person that is working in a manufacturing firm, they still have a job, or if it's the sort of industry that's trying to develop, means that they're able to do so in a strategically advantageous way, and the sorts of institutions that have had power for years and will always have power can now be used and leveraged in the interest of the Chinese people. But secondarily, we tell you, the idea that you're immediately able to get access to the sorts of resources and trade routes and ports that allow you to be able to, one, have access to markets, which means the sorts of internal economic growth that you have are going to be for certain on a huge scale of magnitude of expansion right now, means that individuals right now are able to get fast growth, and that means people are going to be able to escape from the shackles of repression they faced previously. But also we tell you, in terms of the sorts of things that are likely to last, this is how you get lasting institutional hegemony, the way that they're in a lasting way being able to be treated seriously, and means that individuals, not just now, but for the long term in terms of strategic and systematic changes, are able to have power in the global order.
Thank the previous speaker and call upon the deputy leader of the operation.
Rachel starts a speech by establishing that economic growth happens on either side is not to concede that opening government receives huge economic benefits, which is their biggest mistake in our case, but to question the causative claim that just because we observe growth now, that means the prevailing ideology of political expansionism is correct. What Rachel is trying to say is fairly simple. There are two reasons, or two broad reasons, why we would have seen growth on either side, but higher growth on ours if we did not adopt political expansionism. The first is that there is economic growth that is currently stifled because of the perception that China is conflating economic growth and economic investment with political investment. And second, because Chinese political influence is reduced, especially regionally, which I'll talk more about since they want to get into the case on that, but also globally. First, on economic growth and why that happens better on our side. Before that, two big clarifications. The first clarification I want to make is their weird observation that India is not receiving economic growth because they don't have the policy of political expansionism. I posit that India is not receiving economic growth because it's a democracy and it's a huge bureaucratic system that means it cannot effectively coalesce its economic growth compared to China, which is dictatorial and therefore able to make those investments elsewhere, whether or not it's under political expansionism is besides the point. But more importantly, the example of India is quite interesting, right? Because India, one of the bigger players and rising stars in Asia now, didn't join the One Belt, One Road policy precisely because it was suspect of the political influence of China as part of this mechanism, right? I just don't think India is in this debate. If it is, it's on our side. Second, on buying debt, which they repeat for most speakers, I think is a huge benefit. Guys, like, buying debt is an economic mechanism that every damn country does. China buys a bit more debt than others. What I am trying to say here is, in fact, people are suspect of China buying debt only because of its political expansionism. Even though the US and the UK both buy debt, you don't hear people talking about it or using it as an economic mechanism because they simply don't have the same level of political expansionism as China is doing now. They aren't as suspect. So I want to talk about economic growth. Now, the main thing coming from opening government is that the West will hate China anyway. They give you 3 reasons. I'm going to respond to each of them individually and give you more as to why the US will not hate China on the comparative. The first is that China is perceived as a new Western order. The only reason this is true is because their position is oppositional to the US. If they were not positioned as oppositional, like other countries like the UK, for example, they will need not be seen as a new Western order challenging the US. They can be seen as allies as well. I'm unclear why just because they are a rising star, it necessarily means that the West will hate China, since other countries presumably are also rising, but the West does not hate like India as much as they want to talk about that. The second thing they want to make is that people are increasingly suspect of communism. What people are suspect of is not necessarily communism, because before the rise of Xi Jinping and the rise of economic expansionism or political expansionism, we didn't see as much of the US fighting against China as we do see today. The reason they're suspect is because of the whole idea of a dictatorial band of brothers that Xi Jinping is currently building when he's creating allies in the Middle East as part of the political expansionist process, propping up dictatorial governments as a means of entrenching those allies that OG claims is so beneficial. The reason why people are picking up on communism in China is not because of communism per se, but because of the way Chinese political expansionism means that people fear a communist coalition fighting against them. The third claim they make is that you need to pick and choose some enemies. Now, that is just trivially not the reason why the US must pick China, because you easily pick someone else. And in fact, they just well might. They have so many options in the Middle East to pick from as they already are doing. I don't see why, just because they need to pick some enemy, it just happens to land on little dots in China. Just force logic, right? The last thing I want to say is that the reason why the West currently hates China, additional reason why they won't hate the outside, because China is adopting things like unfair economic practices, right? They talk about entrenching investment in these countries. This is precisely the kind of unfair economic practice that the West is known to hate because they want to seem like the bastion of free trade and all that. And WTO is supporting them and is against China for the precise reasons that they're adopting these kind of tactics under political expansionism. The upshot of all this is that the rhetoric behind economic growth here is malleable. If the gains to these countries are sufficiently large and China is not positioned as oppositional, they need not hate China. They don't give us any compelling systemic reason to believe that. And therefore, from this follows all of Rachel's economic benefits, which unfortunately they don't spend quite a lot of time responding to. The first that trade wars are less likely. The only response that trade wars are costly, but they are happening though. So I don't think the US really cares about the cost they're involved. And this demonstrates the short-term harms that we mitigate on our side. The second is that the West is suspect of Chinese investment and Chinese influence in the countries. That means you're less likely to get China coming into these countries and buying over companies and increasing their economic growth as they would on our side. The only response we hear from them is that, well, you can get better deals when you stranglehold over some countries. Well, I'm going to prove later on in my speech that Asia is increasingly suspect of China. So even though China has some dominant influence over countries in Asia, they don't have it over all, and in the long term they will undermine them because they cannot rely on just a few countries to cement their economic influence. What this demonstrates is the long-term harms are involved because you cannot get strong economic allies and investment in some of the largest economies around the world. That is a harm that I think will outweigh the bench. The third thing that Rachel brings to the table is that there is reduced investment on that. Now, the point here is not that China is reliant on investment elsewhere. Obviously, we're not going to posit that because that's just untrue. What we are saying though is that in using investment or capital flows as a bargaining chip, they're stopping some investment coming in trivially as a tool for political expansionism. If you look at Northeast Africa or Indonesia, who are trying to bring in agricultural exports and agricultural technology into China, and China's saying, unless you give up the Paso Islands, unless you give up your land to us, and unless you allow us to control your government, you will not allow those influence in, what that means is that you get less agricultural investment, which will particularly benefit the Chinese poor, a large volume of individuals which we want to protect on our side. I'll think closer.
China doesn't suddenly become a democracy at the point at which it stops being politically expansionist. Hardliners within China will oppose the Politburo and create infighting at the point at which you stop being expansionist.
Like, I mean, we aren't going to claim that China is going to become a fledgling democracy overnight. What we are saying is that there are some democratic forces that exist within China's political or currently stifled because of the political expansionism that reduces the likelihood of long-term democratization in and of itself. It's a huge benefit. Second, I want to talk about political influence. Their biggest claim is that Philippines dropped the suit over the sort of theory down. It's the Parcel Islands, in fact, right? And that leads to less likelihood of war. That's just factually untrue, and I'm not going to just challenge the fact, but it's unlikely because Philippines is a strong US ally, and if the US really hates China, that means they won't allow Philippines to drop the suit anyway. Second, Japan and China are actually increasing naval presence around the Senkaku Islands, which increases likelihood of war. The US has increased naval presence in Asia, particularly because of the fight over the Tiawi-Dao and Senkaku Islands. Allies like the Philippines are seeing a greater naval presence that increases the likelihood of war on there, precisely because China is trying to grab all the land. The last thing I want to posit in my speech is that there is actually regional influence that is limited if China continues what it's doing now. The reason for this is that a lot of countries in Asia are really suspect of the expansionism of China. If you look at ASEAN, for example, which is fundamentally non-interventionist and doesn't want people to intervene in the politics of the country, countries like Singapore and Vietnam, who previously has many economic deals with China, is now increasingly suspect of China. China is like literally taking Singapore's military tanks away from Singapore as a means to exert their influence. And that means you get long run on that, less influence in the region. So their biggest benefit, since they are willing to give up the US and UK economically, which we think is a huge benefit on our side, but also in the region, means that you get less economic growth regionally as well, and you get less ability to create the kind of Southeast Asian coalition opening government claims to posit. At the end of the day, we show two very simple things. First, economic growth is better on our side. Second, China tends to get more political influence within the region and globally on our side, centrally in opening opposition.
Member of opposition, that's them for the opposition side.
The line from closing opposition is that expansionism taints the ability to both make trade something that is sustainable for your allies such that you can have real good qualitative trading that can actually help people and therefore help China, but also that it basically makes it impossible for China to have long-term sustainable growth. What we heard out of our opening was a correct assertion that we do have more trading partners and that's a good thing. What we're going to tell you is why, under a policy of expansionism, it literally becomes impossible for China to trade with its partners in a manner that grows them and therein allows for China to have more long-term economic expansion, which we think is the fundamental underlying thing that has more stability for China, better benefits for its people, and makes all those people better off. I'm going to do a little bit of rebuttal first. One, why is the closing government out of this round? I think their extension is frankly a little bit ridiculous. First, because they are concerned about scale, but they're talking about things that they literally cannot stop or affect definitionally at the margins. They say that Western ideals are going to seep in. Number one, to the degree that you believe that there are leaks from the internet, these ideas are still going to be seeping in, but there's still a wherewithal for those things to come into these places. Number two, to the degree that you can't convince the West that this expansionism is good, the source of those ideas is still going to exist. And number three, how do you actually get people to ignore these things? It's via them saying, we know what these ideas are, we think the Chinese model for growth is better. So if we can show you that growth actually gets better on our side and is sustainable, then that's probably going to be a better way to combat the rooting of those Western ideals. The other argument they make is they say that China's going to get more hardline and that's going to be good. But remember, the way that China becomes more hardline is when the economy isn't doing well, because then they're constrained on resources and they have to compensate in other ways. So I think that that's pretty clear. The other thing is, they did that for opening. It was pretty obvious. Okay. A little bit of rebuttal to the opening opposition, to the opening government. They say you're going to get more trade deals, a coalition of allies, and you're going to be able to act as a bloc and get more leverage. Number one, No, you aren't, because people aren't, contrary to what they say, going to be grateful because there's no previous attention. One, because they're going to be angry that you took one of their ports and you basically made it your own, which is the definition of neocolonialism. The things are optically bad. In the same way that Mugabe was mad about things vis-a-vis America, this creates the same kind of political fodder in many of these countries with regards to China. The other thing, though, is that people aren't experiencing the regular benefits of trade in these instances, so they really don't have that kind of thing that excuses these sorts of actions. Because remember, it's things like Chinese laborers being used to construct these projects as the conditionality for one belt, one road, meaning the conditionality that they have taints the reasons as to why trade would typically be good and therefore makes people very angry. When you have populaces that are angry at their either democratic or non-democratic governments, they are not going to be very likely to be easy to coordinate with, to act as a bloc along the same lines as the European Union, which would be the very best case for them, but I think that it's just not plausible. They're not going to act as a bloc for that reason. Probably easier to act as a bloc to the degree that you integrate with those economies and you don't put conditions on them. We think that that's much better. The other thing is, the very best case for them is that they get more natural resources. They're like, oh, the reason this all matters is that you need more natural resources and you need to not have resource skirmishes and you need China to be able to grow because it's resource starved. Look, one, I think the fact that we have fairly efficient world markets takes out the importance of this argument to the degree that if you get direct control or quasi-direct control of some oil, it doesn't matter because that has to be sold on the global market anyways. So the cheapest prices for these goods is always going to be the one that has everybody trying to sell against each other. So it's not clear why direct control is good. The competing narrative is this. You don't need to directly control via political conditions and influencing the opposition natural resources. What it means to have free trade is you can effectively buy all of those goods because people are setting fair terms anyway. So it was an outdated notion of expansionism given the reality of global trade. I think that doesn't make much sense. The other thing, though, and now, actually, you know what? I'm going to move. Actually, open it if you have one.
Yeah.
Chinese leaders are authoritarian leaders who don't care just about economic stability, but believe in a philosophy of the Middle Kingdom that doesn't go away just because your side said it does.
It doesn't matter what philosophy they believe in. What matters is the place where they source their legitimacy, which is in being able to provide economic benefits to people. That is literally the narrative that China has pushed for the longest time. The reason people accept an abrogation of their rights is the fact that they get, and they perceive that the regime gets them more benefits in turn. I think that doesn't make much sense. Okay. Two things on our side. One, why we get better trading partners on our side, which is more important than what these guys tell you, because they just tell you we get more trading partners, we get more reliable partners, and we grow the partners that we do have for more sustainable growth. And the second thing is going to be why we get better internal growth, why expansionism intrinsically benefits SOEs, state-owned enterprises, and makes it very difficult for the internal economy to be competitive. Number one, why do we get a better character of trading partners? Think about the types of conditionalities that are imposed in these instances. You say that we're going to take your port if you can't pay the debt back. It's Chinese laborers who have to build these sorts of things, and we're investing in many cases, as they said, because you're resource starved, in mineral resources, etc. The issue is that you often leave these countries debt-riddled because the intention of the expansionist loan was for them to default. That means that it's harder for them to get credit from elsewhere. It's harder for them to expand because literally their track record on paying back debt is bad, and the fact that China now owns a port in Sri Lanka is evidence of that country's non-creditworthiness. That makes it more difficult for them to get diversified sources of credit to grow other industries in the economy. To the degree that they're building public works, and to the degree that they are building things, they're doing it for being resource-starved to the degree that they tell you, and that just means that they're only focusing on the industries that they care about. Whereas if you were to just allow people who wanted to invest, you would get more investment in other industries. So what happened in Tanzania, they literally had a diversifying economy, and then they counter-diversified when China started to invest, and they said, you need to focus on the Tanzanite industry, and the infrastructure needs to be focused around that as well. I think what that means is that on their side, they make it harder for these countries to sustainably grow in a way that employs people, because they also force Chinese laborers to be the ones doing this. The implication is you don't have inclusive growth, and you don't have those people as a consumer base that can actually buy Chinese goods in the long term, make them a more profitable enterprise. That's the kind of growth that you need. The other thing is, the reason why, and these guys don't tell you, you need Western trading partners and democratic trading partners in general, is the fact that they're more reliable than the authoritarian regimes that you're trying to instill, because they're just less likely to renege on things and be irrational because power is not concentrated in a way to move as quickly. The implication being that having better trading partners that you don't alienate is a good thing precisely because they will not shut you off, because the economic harms would be so bad and the populace would vote the government out. If you have more reliable trading partners and you have trading partners who grow better to buy your goods, I think that's better for the economic growth of China. The final thing I want to say very quickly is, when you want to have an expansionist trade policy, the reason that's bad is you must prioritize state-owned enterprises to the degree that you want to control them and use them for the expansionist narrative. The implication being you have more contracts and more efficacy to those state-owned enterprises to the exclusion of other industries in China and other industries that are trying to break into that sector. We think that's a bad thing, one, for China's ability to sustainably grow, which is what actually matters, and no, because it does trickle through to people, and two, for their ability to have reasonable consumer bases, we are so, so proud to oppose.
Okay, so the speaker and so from the opposition witness group this debate.
Strings attached that a lot of countries like. OO contests this quite well, but it relies to a certain extent on the naivete of countries to say that China doesn't always have some sort of political interest at stake. We will make no such assumption. What we explain is that by this type of deals and the specific means by which they use this political leverage undermines the economies of their trading nations, which both makes China weaker because they have weaker trading partners, but also undermines their political influence at the same time that the kind of structural changes incentivized within China is going to be ultimately harmful. The number one impact we consider here largely is going to be the economy, because that is the basis under which the Chinese government bases their legitimacy. The response that we heard from the opposing government is the assertion that isn't the type of rhetoric based on expansionism now. If that assertion is true, note that the reason why they would be pushing for expansionism is the idea that Chinese pride, that we are so successful that we should export our model elsewhere. Well, if you're failing at home then, I think that pride just dries up. So as a result, I think that people wouldn't be pushing for these types of expansionism, and people, if the economy actually is going to go downturn. Then they say, well, the economy is not that important because the benefits don't trickle down to other individuals. And somehow, our own opening seems to try to imply that as well. Well, here is the reason why I think there's some level of trickle down. It makes impudent sense that you don't need to have the average Chinese person own the business in order to benefit from it. You just need a Chinese person to be a person who buys products. If they can get better economic deals, if they can get better trade deals, and if their economy is more vibrant, they're better able to buy things. I think this mechanism makes a lot of sense. Before we get into the more important parts of the round, let's deal briefly with the CG extension. I think this is fairly weak by evidence of the fact that OO tries to go after us in their POI LC. The reason why I think this argument doesn't make a whole lot of sense is that it's basically this idea that China's would be more repressive if they feel like they're not surrounded by a bunch of other communist countries and that they're going to feel under threat. The reason it doesn't make sense is the main way in which non-communist ideas diffuse into China isn't from their neighboring countries like Bhutan and Nepal. It comes from the United States, it comes from the European Union. To the extent to which they say they still have internet access and get access to these ideas, unless you believe that their type of political expansionism would be able to convince the entire United States that all 250 years of their history has been a mistake, I don't think they're going to win the round. So let's go to the first question that we hear a lot of, particularly from the opening government, of whether or not the actual political influence of the Chinese expands as a result of this political expansionist policy. But here's the reason why we don't think this is the case. Because although it is often in the interest of other countries in the short term to accept these type of sweetheart deals because they gave to build large, for instance, ports that can have their own leader's name on it, it's not in their interest in the long run. A couple reasons for this. First off, is that most of these projects are built with Chinese laborers and end up crowding out domestic workforces who might otherwise be able to produce things. Second off, in many cases locks them in to an economy that's very much predicated on natural resource extraction, because that's the exact character of the investment that we hear that even OG concedes, which makes it much harder for these countries to develop in the long run, because the only investment that comes in is going to be in the natural resource sector. Third reason, the only one that actually gets a response, is these countries are going to be extremely debt-riddled, because the actual mechanism by which these countries try to exert this political influence is by leaving them in debt. They say a couple things here. First off, you can't generalize besides Sri Lanka and Pakistan. Well, the reason why we think this can generalize is the actual mechanism by which they get influence is by keeping them in debt, which is a fairly strong intuitive reason to suspect this debt is going to be true. Then they say, well, even if they are in debt, what can they do? They can do nothing to us. Well, the only reason they arguably can't do anything to them is because China has such a large economy. That's a reason why we don't need the political expansion in order to be actually able to help them. Moreover, I think they are likely to be doing something. What can they do? They cannot allow more firms to come into these countries. The fact is, most of the time when you build this infrastructure, that's front-loaded. The railroad's built. They don't need the Chinese there anymore. They don't, and as a result, I think they can actually retaliate in the long run. Even if they don't explicitly retaliate, they can implicitly retaliate, which is just have an economic recession because you're doing poorly. What does that do? It makes it harder for China to be able to export goods because they don't have a viable trading partner who is able to afford any Chinese goods. As a result, I think there are going to be substantial harms here. But what is the other reason why we get less leverage? Because to the extent to which they have other countries, the countries you can't get the sweetheart deals. Think about what would happen if you say to everyone, if you open up your markets, we'll pay you $100 billion. No one else is going to be able to want to open up their markets for free. They're all going to want to have a little piece of that pie, which means if they want to expand their influence to any other countries that they aren't doing right now, they're going to have to spend enormous amounts of money. Why is that bad? Because we hear that there's a substantial risk of a recession in the long run. To the extent that that is true, we think that they're never going to be able to effectively engage in this type of policy or any sort of diplomacy because everyone else is going to want to expect money. This restrains your ability to do diplomacy in the long run. Yeah, what's up?
Allowing Africa to develop part of Western influences harms China, which loses the upper hand. China doesn't need these economies to develop holistically. They need access to specific resources right now that allow them to manufacture things that they sell to large markets that already exist, like the US.
One, on the specific point of natural resources, you can get it the same way the United States gets natural resources, buying it on the open market. The fact of the matter is, you're better able to do that on our side of the house. Second off, even if these African countries are under Western influence, they still need to buy cheap products. And the West doesn't produce these type of cheap products. They're still going to want to buy the type of products that China is producing, even if they grow under this nebulous idea of Western influence. Let's pivot now to the question of economics, which I think is the controlling question in the round. Two reasons why the economy of China gets harmed. First off, as we talked about, it undermines the actual economy, the economy of your foreign partner, which is particularly important because in the event of a Chinese recession, if it ever happens, then they need to have someone else be able to buy their goods to offset the decreased aggregate demand that happens in China. But second off, it also undermines the actual structural development in China, which is that the only mechanism by which you can actually exert political influence through trade is if it's state-owned enterprises specifically engaging it. Because that's the only one the Chinese government has enough leverage to make these type of specific changes and specific push for things. Which means the type of private businesses in China have much less access to resources than the type of state-owned enterprises, choking off the dynamism in the economy because the only ones going to access to funds are firms that are very much tied to the Chinese government, because the Chinese government has to exert substantial amounts of favoritism towards these types of businesses. What are the possible reasons in which they can help the economy on their side of the house? First off, they can get actually just simply more treaties to open up the markets. I think it's unlikely the case because everyone wants access to these type of products, but they're going to hold out for longer on their side of the house so they can also get a piece of this type of development money. But second off, that they get these type of natural resources. Here's the fact of the matter. They never explain to you why these type of very specific natural resources are ultimately necessary. Let's grant in the best case that you can't get it on the open market. Note that the vast majority of the type of resources you need are things like coal, basic imports like lumber, etc. These are things that have lots of different countries that produce them and aren't hyper-specific. A general attitude through which people are have a more favorable disposition to you better helps grow the trading of China and better helps grow the actual economies of their trading partner, which diffusively benefits China as well. And this is why we're so valuable.